Hello everyone, Anita here and welcome to another video. Now today, instead of a regular painting, I've decided to do a little bit of a demonstration video, I suppose, of how I use soft pastels with watercolors. Since I've noticed there was a huge interest in it in the comments under my past few videos. So why not? I mean, I haven't done one of these before. There it is. So bear in mind that this is purely just my perspective. I don't even remember when I got the idea or how exactly I got the idea to use soft pastels with watercolors. But I've prepared some of my older paintings so you can see exactly how it evolved. All of my paintings are already sold, so I have just a few of them. But I hope I can present the idea properly. This is purely soft pastel and colored pencils, a drawing, I suppose. And I really like the idea of very soft and not textured drawings. And I really like the very pure transitions between colors, the very delicate gradients, and I got the idea to use soft pastels for it because I wanted to use very clean, very hot pressed basically paper, but I didn't know what hot pressed was back then, as these are from 2013. So I had this sketchbook that had really nice paper I liked a lot, and I just experimented on top of those pages. And because the paper was too thin to use watercolor, so I've used mostly soft pastels and colored pencils to create the effects I wanted. And you can see I'm concentrating here mostly on the background. And I'm not really creating shapes with the soft pastels, that's what I'm using colored pencils for. But I'm using soft pastels for the gradients, for the soft colors. Here that's the effect of rain. And eventually I found a little bit better paper. It still wasn't hot pressed. Once again, I didn't know it existed back then. But it had much less texture than the regular watercolor paper I've used before. And so I started experimenting with layering soft pastel on top of watercolor. And as you can see back then, I've used the very delicate colors. And then I've used soft pastel on top to create the gradient or the shading, but only in the background. I didn't use that on the characters because that would require way too much precision. And I've used only my fingers or Q-tips for the soft pastel, so that was just way too much work, honestly. Now, eventually, I was just playing with it with different mediums, layering on top of gouache and watercolor. This is a piece from 2015 that has a pattern, but I've used soft pastels in the background. As you can see, I'm pointing with my fingers where it is. It's that darker shade layered on top of a lighter watercolor to create those digital effects. When you have, the lighter middle, darker edges. That's exactly what I was thinking when I was creating that. Here is another way I'm using soft pastels a lot. It's just to create glow. Glow in background pretty much is what I use the soft pastels for. And in this case, I've layered first a darker soft pastel, and then on top of it, after it was sealed, I've used a lighter one to create that glowy effect. In the end, this painting was way too dark, in my opinion. The character does not stand out at all, and that bothered me a bit. But I really loved the way the glow came out. I'm going to talk about it a bit later, but white soft pastel is a bit tricky to layer compared to darker colors. So, for example, here, this is a piece from 2016, and you're definitely familiar with it if you're watching me for a while, because it's one of the very first videos I've released on this channel. And here I've used darker colors, blue and darker colors to even out watercolors. That's another thing I like to use if, for example, the watercolor doesn't layer nicely and evenly enough. Like I said, I had a big problems with textures back then. I still am. I don't really like textures that much in my watercolors. So whenever I had a bit of texture that I didn't like or too much texture, I would just even it out with soft pastel of the same color. Another thing, I like to use soft pastels to enhance the colors in the watercolors. And so as you can see here, I have a nice edge around the picture with just the same color that was used for painting, but it was in soft pastel to create that soft, feathery look. Similar idea here, where I'm just using soft pastels to create a gradient. I basically layered soft pastel on top of a pattern that I've created before. It was a little bit of an experiment. As you can see here, I'm also showing you close how the texture looks, because it's not exactly smooth if you layer darker colors on top of lighter colors. Plus, you have to be very careful. As you can see here, there was a little scrape I did with my nail, I think, either with my nail or with the paintbrush, and it created a little dent in the paper, changed the texture of the paper, and because of that, the soft pastel didn't layer the same as on the rest of the paper, and created a difference which I didn't desire. Another very background, yet again, very good example of how I create backgrounds with soft pastels. I create a base in watercolor and then I layer the pastel on top to enhance the colors, even them out, make them softer. The transitions are much cleaner. And also I'm showing you here that after sealing the painting a few times with just a regular sealant, I'm going to show you a bit later in the video, the pastel does not come off at all, and I'm rubbing quite hard on it right here, just because I wanted to show you. There is a bit of a shadow on my finger, but that would happen even if you were, that's just the pigment coming off. That would happen even if you had a regular watercolor. And here is the latest painting I've done with soft pastels. And I wanted to show this one because of the texture that was created after I've sealed the soft pastel. A lot of the softness in the soft pastel disappears after you add moisture to it. And it's not bothering me, so probably you don't even notice the difference. But there is a slight difference, like a change in texture that you should just know about and be prepared for, so that it doesn't ruin your final piece. It's just something that you should know. So these are the paintings that I have left. I hope I've explained a little bit more clearly, how I use the pastels. Basically, in my case, it's just backgrounds, enhancing of colors, creating glow. Not really working on the little shape and details, just the bigger picture. So here are the 3 types of soft pastels that I'm using. This particular set is a very cheap one that I've picked up at, I think it costs like €1 or maybe €2, something like that. And I use this set to practice. I use it to just experiment with, because these soft pastels are very cheap, but they're still not bad. But I wouldn't use them on a painting that I would potentially sell, just because I don't know how light fast they are or how they will react with the sealant or with watercolor. So I use these just purely to experiment. Now these are my master's pastels. These are the set I use most often because there is a huge selection of colors inside. They're quite inexpensive. I believe this is a Chinese brand. And I've picked them up, I think, that's an exaggeration, around 4 years ago on vacation in Poland. Just because they were cheap and there was a lot of colors. But I've asked the art manager, art store manager, and he told me that a lot of professionals use these, at least they buy them from him, because they are good for experimenting and they are not as expensive as really art grade soft pastels. Of course, they are perfect for what I'm using soft pastels for, but I still think these are more of a student grade rather than artist grade. So another box I have, and this one is even older than the Master's Pastels. I believe I have it for at least 8 to 10 years. And I bought this set because of the size of the pastels inside. There was a lot of colors, but they were all very small. And the reason I bought them was because I wanted to use them on ball-jointed dolls, just for shading the dolls. And I love that they were small, they were quite inexpensive, and there was a big selection of colors. Now this was some kind of limited edition case. It was on sale back then. I think I paid maybe €25 for it. But these are actually the best quality out of all three sets. And I use them mostly for just real pieces that I'm planning to sell, or that I want really good quality of the shading on, because they really perform well. Just in my personal opinion of a person who just uses these soft pastels just for adding the little touches to my watercolor paintings, because you have to remember that I'm not, a soft pastel artist. So here are the other things I use. You have an X-Acto knife in the background and some Q-tips, which I use very rarely these days. And this is the protective spray that I'm using for all my paintings, and this is for watercolor and gouache, but it works perfectly fine for the soft pastel. I presume it's only because there aren't that many layers of it. It's usually just one layer of soft pastel. So I think the protective spray doesn't have any problems keeping it all together. But for just experimenting and layering, I often use hairspray. And I would suggest using that if you're just playing around or just want to experiment on some scrap paper, because it's a very inexpensive way of protecting your picture or your experiment. And you don't have to use up your expensive real art sprayer. So here I'm going to show you how I prepare my soft pastels for use in the watercolor pictures. I've decided to show you just a little gradient, how I layer them, and this is just purely my version. I really didn't look it up anywhere. It was just something that I did learn through trial and error, and I've learned that this way is the best for ensuring that the watercolor, that there isn't that weird texture poking through, because I will show you later, it's gonna come out, because that's the whole point of this demonstration. You have to layer the soft pastels properly, otherwise you're just going to have a weird texture coming through. So what I do is I take my X-Acto knife and I very gently scrape off just a little bit of the soft pastel. Now you have to be very careful with that, just to do it very slowly, and so that you get a fine powder instead of little chunks. And the reason for that is that when you start rubbing the little chunks on top of your paper, instead of nice, smooth, feathery effect, you're gonna get tiny lines. Unless it's something you go for, of course, you should go for the soft, just very pure powder. So what I like to do in this case, I actually did really nice. There weren't any big chunks. Excuse me. But I'm still going through, just kind of like slicing the powder, making sure there aren't very big lumps in there, just to ensure that I don't have any trouble in the end. It is very important for me, for my style of painting. It might not be important for you. Always make sure to adjust any technique to your needs. That's what I've done through my years of experimentation and painting, and I feel confident to say that, if you learn something from the internet, from YouTube, learn it by all means, but eventually you're gonna change it just to fit your needs and your style of painting, and that's perfectly fine. So here in the background, I'm preparing the rest of the powders. As you can see, I have a nice gradient of going from yellow to a bit lighter green, then darker green, and then a little bit of black. The darker the color, the more pigmented it is, at least in these cheap sets. So, for example, black is very potent and you don't need a lot of it. But for example, yellow, I usually find myself layering more of lighter colors than the darker ones. So I'm starting with, and this is sped up a little bit, but only a little bit, it's just twice the speed. And so I'm starting with the lightest color, and I always do that. I always start with the lightest color if I work on a light background. So in this case, on this light paper, I'm going to start with the lightest color. If I started on a darker paper and wanted a smooth transition, I would start with the darkest color and work towards the lightest one. So I'm making this background for the green to be layered on top. And even though I want just a sliver to show in the whole pattern, in the whole gradient, I want just a little bit of yellow, I'm still making sure to layer quite a big chunk of it, just because it's gonna be a nice background for the green. And the idea is that with me just picking up the green pigment right now, I'm combining it with the loose powder the loose yellow powder that's still on the paper. And I'm mixing them slightly together to create that smooth transition. So I'm just really gently rubbing the green pigment on top of yellow, and I'm doing it really, really gently. Because if eventually you're going to just start rubbing really hard because you want that pigment to really work itself into the paper. At least that's what I do. Usually when I work the pigment into the paper, into the painting, the whole table is shaking because of the force. But here I'm really starting very, very gently. And that's because you want to make sure that there aren't any harder edges or chunks in your powder that could create potential lines. And these are very hard to fix. Once you have a line there, unless you put more darker covering pigment on top, at least I didn't find a way to get rid of it, unless of course you want to just rub everything off with an eraser, which is fine, but usually I want everything. These are usually the last touches in my painting process. So I don't want to just spend too much time on it. That's just an extra touch, not the whole painting. And so I always make sure to take that part easy at the beginning so that I have, easier time once I make sure that there are no lumps and there are no lines, because I want that smooth gradient, then the real work starts. So this is how it looks right now. And I'm going to start adding that darker green. And as you can see here, I'm adding it actually on top of the paper instead of top of the light green. And now this is on purpose because I wanted to show you that if you don't prepare that yellow strip to go all the way up, the paper is going to show slightly through because, of course, from what I understand at least, once again, I'm not really a soft pastel artist. I don't really paint in soft pastels or draw. Always confused about that. But from what I understand, when you work with soft pastels, you just keep layering and layering and layering. In my case, it's usually just one layer, just the way I'm presenting it right now. And so I want to make sure that the color is even. And that's why I put on the paper that first light layer of yellow. And that layer is the background for all my other colors so that the paper doesn't show through. Of course, that's a bit less visible. In most of the cases, that's the basic watercolor layer that I put. That's my yellow in this case. But if you just keep layering darker colors on top of lighter paper, you're going to get a little bit of texture showing through. And that's not going to show right now. That's going to show after you seal it. Because when you wet the soft pastel with the sealant, with the sealing spray, as you can see, I'm showing it from the close-up, and it looks very chalky. It looks smooth. But once you actually cover it with spray, and in this case, I'm just using just a regular hairspray to cover it, you're gonna notice that a lot of that chalkiness is gonna be gone, and you're gonna be left with more pigment. But that chalkiness was making sure that your texture was even. Now, once again, I'm going to mention that it's probably just me, just because I'm very, very, I like my smooth textures. I don't like to have any grain or grit or anything like that in my gradients. And so perhaps you're going to be sitting here looking at it very intently and thinking, oh my God, she's crazy. And that's fine. But what I'm looking for in my gradients is just very soft finish, and that's why I make sure to layer. For example, see, is the transition between the yellow and the light green is very smooth, whereas when the darker colors come on top of it, it's still, in my eye at least, it's quite smooth between the darker green and the lighter green, but once the darker color comes in at the top, there's a lot of grain. So the paper basically shows through in my eye. And that's fine. And that's fine in this case. But what I mean is you have to know your medium. You have to know how it reacts and how it behaves so that you can be prepared for what to expect at the end of your painting process. So here, another very, I do that quite a lot, that I layer lighter colors on top of a darker background. And in this case, I'm painting on just a block of paper, a very cheap block of paper. So you will see more texture than what I would like. This pretty much disappears once I'm painting on a regular arch paper, for example. But what I will usually do, for example, when I create a glow of a lantern or any kind of magical glow, it's usually either white or yellow, maybe very light electric blue and white, one of those combinations. I will start with a base, and then I'm going to seal it. And as you can see, when I seal it, the yellow just disappears completely. Now, the white is a little bit more resilient when it comes to that. Now, once the layer of sealant dries, some of that pigment comes back. But as you can see here, there's not much yellow left. There's much more white left than yellow. And what I want to say by that is that be prepared that different chalk pastels react in a different way. And so, for example, as you can see here, it looks beautiful when you layer it just like as it is on a top of watercolor, because the background is watercolor. But once you seal it, it's gonna disappear. And that actually doesn't have anything to do with the spray being a hairspray. It's when I use a gouache and watercolor spray, it just behaves exactly the same. So what I will do in that case is that, here's another example. What I usually do in that case is that I use white as the main glow, almost always. And as you can see here, once I've added the white on top of the yellow, it enhanced the yellow. It's still yellow, but the pigment doesn't disappear because it's mixed with that little bit of white. And in my case, that's just how my soft pastels behave, so it might be different for you. But I really encourage you to experiment with your own soft pastels and see how they behave. Make samples, seal them with a sealant, and see how the color disappears. It might be as well that the color disappears for me because it's not a proper sealant for soft pastels. But because my watercolor paintings are my main focus, I want to make sure that the watercolor is protected and not the soft pastel. The soft pastel is an extra. So here, as I'm adding just a little bit of detail, I hope you've liked the video and you have learned something from it. And if you would like to see more detailed videos on some kind of soft pastel related topic, then let me know in the comments below. And I'm going to think if I can make a video, if I feel comfortable about making a video on that topic. And don't forget to like the video, of course, if you liked it, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so very much for watching. I will see you next time. Bye!